Welcome to the second day of this international workshop on the Nonline movement in socialist Yugoslavia. My name is Jelena Vasiljevic. I'm a senior researcher at the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory in Belgrade, and I will be chairing today's panel on internationalism, pragmatism, idealism. We have two sessions, four speakers, two commentators, and we will begin now with Professor Peter Willits of the City University of London, and then Chiara Bonfiglioli from the University College Cork. Commentator is Konstantin Kilibarda, York University, Canada. So I will now just let the floor is yours. And I will just briefly remind you that we have roughly around 15 minutes for presentations, 6 to 7 minutes for commentators, for comments, and then the floor will be open to all others. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I've got a subtitle, The Trouble with History is that it all happened in the past. So I'm going to talk about differing histories of the Nonline. I will argue that there are two major competing histories. Sorry, what's happened now? There's a YouTube intervention. Is it on your screen?
You're on YouTube, don't worry. No, keep going, Peter.
Oh, it's Paul, right, sorry. I will argue there are two major competing histories about what unites developing countries. One is conservative continental solidarity, and the other is radical anti-colonial non-alignment. I will demonstrate how these histories were created and expressed by different political leaders and used to mobilize support in different conferences of developing countries. Then I will attempt to explain why continental solidarity has supplanted non-alignment during the last decade. I will end by suggesting current circumstances may allow those who want a more progressive future to assert a new form of non-aligned movement. The history we tell about developing countries and the non-aligned movement has changed across time, and it is also changing according to who is telling the story. In the 1950s and 1960s, there was direct rivalry between these two sets of ideas. First was bicontinental solidarity. That is the solidarity of two continents, Asia and Africa, based on the right of all countries to have equal status as independent legal units called states. This was expressed in the 10 principles adopted at the Asian African Conference held in the Indonesian city of Bandung in April 1955. It was a relatively conservative ideology. It did not challenge the nature of the global system. The second set of ideas was non-alignment. That is solidarity in rejecting the hierarchical nature of the global system. One strand was the challenge to Soviet American competition and rejection of assumptions that all governments must choose an allegiance in the Cold War. A second strand was their commitment to accelerate the process of decolonization. This was expressed in the declarations adopted at Belgrade. Both Bandung and Belgrade sought to reduce Cold War tensions and to enable colonial countries to become independent, but their arguments differed substantially. Bandung aimed to bring together all governments in Asia and Africa, both Cold War allies of the West and Cold War allies of the East. Bandung's anti-colonialism was compromised by the desire of some to label the Soviet Union as colonialist. The differences were papered over by referring to colonialism in all its manifestations. Belgrade rejected many governments from Asia and Africa and accepted governments from Europe and Latin America. Much greater attention was given to promoting anti-colonialism, to the rejection of apartheid in South Africa, and to the support for Palestinian rights later on. Indeed, the Palestinian Liberation Organization was made a full member of the Non-Aligned in August 1975, a year before it was accepted into the Arab League. There was also institutional rivalry between bicontinentalism and non-alignment. In April 1961, a joint Chinese-Indonesian communique attempted to preempt the Belgrade Conference by calling for a second Asian African conference as soon as possible. In 1964, the main reason for convening the second Nonline conference in Cairo was actually to prevent a second Bandung going ahead. Perhaps the greatest success of the Bandung Conference was the immediate formation in 1955 of an Afro-Asian group at the United Nations. But it did not last. The Afro-Asian group was replaced by the Nonline Coordinating Bureau in the early 1970s, when the NAM changed from being a series of ad hoc conferences to being a complex institution. Until 1998, the Nonline did not in any way acknowledge the Bandung Conference, nor endorse the 10 principles. I will now turn to the events that show there were two different sets of leaders who were promoting the different ideologies of bicontinentalism and non-alignment. Bicontinentalism started with Nehru of India and Sukarno of Indonesia promoting Asian solidarity, and then seeking to engage the new countries emerging from the decolonization of North Africa. There is no historical controversy about who were the main leaders convening the Bandung Conference. On the other hand, the origins of the non-aligned are highly contested. Oops, I'm trying to do a share screen, but it's not quite, there we are. Can you see the leaders there?
Yes, yes.
Good. On the internet, Nehru and Sukarno are listed with Nkrumah, Nasser, and Tito as the founders of the non-aligned movement. And indeed, if you go to India, that is the common assumption. However, saying each of these 5 leaders was an important leader does not mean each one was important in the foundation of the non-aligned. There is no evidence that either Nkrumah or Sukarno had any significant role in bringing the non-aligned together, except for their participation in a joint initiative at the UN. And this photograph, which has no lasting effect, except for being transmitted widely on the internet, is of the 5 leaders standing together in the Yugoslav permanent mission to the UN on that day in September 1960. But Tito, Nasser, and Nehru did meet together frequently, both bilaterally and twice as a threesome in the 1950s. Their collaboration during the 1956 Suez Crisis was a crucial moment, both in the Cold War and for the end of the European empires. Tito and Nasser, but not Nehru, would just 5 years later initiate the Belgrade summit. Oh, sorry. It defies many people's assumptions, but I would argue the key figure bringing in together the non-aligned, above all, was Tito. From 1954, Tito actively pursued a foreign policy focused on cooperation with African and Asian countries. He took a set of 4 long journeys in a Yugoslav Navy training ship called Galev. These journeys led to the ship becoming known as Brodmira Galev, the peace ship Seagull. From December 1954 to February 1955, Tito went to India and Burma, stopping on the way home to host Nasser and Nehru at Suez. From December 1955 to January 1956, Tito went to Ethiopia and Egypt. 3 years later, he went to Indonesia, Burma, India, Ceylon, Ethiopia, and Sudan, again stopping in Egypt. And from February 1961 to April 1961, and what a long time that is, to be away from one's home political system, Tito went to Ghana, Togo, Liberia, Guinea, Mali, Morocco, and Tunisia, ending with 6 days in Egypt. The last of these journeys was crucial to the history of the non-aligned. Tito pressed hard for his idea of bringing together a conference of uncommitted countries. Nehru had been opposed to this because he was promoting a major role for India in global politics, exercising moral leadership. Sukarno had been trying to convene a second Bandung. Tito persuaded Nasser to go ahead. On 22nd of September 1961, on the Galev, in the Suez Canal, they issued a joint communique saying consultations between the Nonline countries are indispensable. Right, just closing that down. In May, Sukarno joined Tito and Nasser to announce formal invitations to a preparatory conference in Cairo. They said Nero is happy to join us in extending this invitation. But this is an interesting source written in the early 1960s from an Indian perspective. And the author Janssen described Nero's attitude as uneasy, compulsory cooperation. The final outcome was the first Nonline summit in September 1961, with 25 countries attending. They were 10 of the 28 African countries then in the UN, 11 of the 19 Asian countries then in the UN, plus Algeria, Yugoslavia, Cyprus, and Cuba. Only 1/3 of the independent African countries were invited because deep divisions had arisen in Africa in 1960 between the radical Casablanca group, who did join the non-aligned, and the conservative Brazzaville group, who were kept out of the non-aligned. I hope I've convinced you that the Bandung Conference did not provide the intellectual origins of non-alignment, did not provide the institutional origins of the non-aligned movement, and did not have the same membership as the movement. But that is not the end of the story. A different history appears today at non-aligned events. Gradually, from the late 1990s, under Presidents Clinton, Bush Jr., and Trump, the United States became more willing to use military force and/or economic sanctions. The rhetoric of Cold War non-alignment became increasingly inappropriate to challenge the USA. The conservative legal approach of the Bandung 10 Principles provided a more compelling rhetoric. They included, number 2, respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity of all nations. Number 4, abstention from interference in the internal affairs of another country. Number 7, refraining from acts or threats of aggression. And number 8, settlement of all international disputes by peaceful means. Thus, Bandung was first invoked by the non-aligned in the final document of the 12th summit in South Africa in September 1998, just a few days after Clinton ordered the bombing of a pharmaceutical factory in the Sudan. A sustained attempt followed to obtain endorsement by the non-aligned of the Bandung Principles, and achieved success at the 14th Summit Conference in Havana in September 2006. This produced a strange compromise. An annex to the final document at Havana provided a list of the founding principles of the non-aligned movement. The annex quoted the full text of the 10 principles from Bandung, but did not provide any information whatsoever that identified the origins of this text. The growing support among the non-aligned for invoking the Bandung Principles resulted in the movement sponsoring a UN resolution in December 2018 to declare the 24th of April as the International Day of Multilateralism and Diplomacy for Peace. The date commemorated the day in 1955 when the Bandung Conference ended. But the UN resolution, again, made no explicit mention of the Bandung Conference. The purpose of this resolution was to provide a coded rejection by the UN and by the non-aligned who sponsored this resolution of the Trump's America First rhetoric and policies. All this change is a clear example of history being rewritten to legitimize positions taken in current political controversies. History is what we say today, not what happened in the past. The non-aligned institutions have also broken down in recent years. What really divided the non-aligned was not the end of the Cold War, as many people expected, but it was their reactions to the Arab Spring of 2011 and the civil war in Syria. Iran held the chair of the non-aligned from August 2012 until September 2016. The Iranians have actively supported the Syrian government, while the Saudis and other Gulf countries, members of the Nonline, have actively supported the rebels. Contrary to all past practice, the Nonline have not been able to adopt any position on this conflict between member countries. All they could do was to commend Lebanon's generosity in hosting refugees from Syria. Normally, in the past, they would have called for the withdrawal of all foreign forces and promoted a process of mediation. There has been silence on the Syrian civil war. The Venezuelans held the chair from September 2016 to October 2019. This also produced divisions within the movement. Since January 2019, when NAM statements have supported President Nicolas Maduro, Latin American governments that recognize Juan Guaido as president have dissociated themselves from these statements. Equally, the choice of Azerbaijan, a new member of the movement, to take over the chair in 2019 has generated substantial problems. Azerbaijan is a close ally of Israel, and the latest Nonline statement in October 2020 failed to offer any support at all to the Palestinians. In addition, during a short, ferocious war between Azerbaijan and Armenia, the same meeting issued a special declaration expressing their solidarity with Azerbaijan. The declaration did not call for a ceasefire, and it did not mention the work of the Minsk group acting as mediators in the dispute. Many governments have reduced their commitments to the movement and downgraded their attendance at its meetings. During a decade when the chair has been held by 3 different governments that have each sought to gain support for their own position, the decision-making process has broken down. But not all political change is negative. Under Azerbaijani leadership, the NAM obtained agreement to convene a UN General Assembly special session in December 2020 on the COVID pandemic. The multidimensional global problems generated by the pandemic are making many political actors reassess the nature of global politics. In addition, the reality of the climate crisis in recent years has at long last created a sense of the imminent threats to human existence on planet Earth. The next Nonline summit is due to be held in Uganda in 2022. This offers the possibility of a new leadership that is not in conflict with many of the movement's members. The world needs a new radicalism. The call for a recovery that builds better and builds green might, just might, provide a better new role for the non-aligned. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Willits, very much. And we're doing just fine with the time. So now I invite Chiara Bonfiglioli to go ahead with her presentation. Chiara, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yelena. I'm going to try to share the screen. Give me just a moment. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Sorry, yeah, there you go. No, just a moment. So today I'm going to be talking about representing women's non-aligned encounters, a view from Yugoslavia. And as we know, generally the non-aligned movement is represented as a male affair, while women's experiences of and participation in the non-aligned movement and the role of gender discourses as only marginally explored in the most recent literature. If we turn to women's and gender history, however, transnational East-West, East-South, and South-South encounters have been increasingly addressed as a result of renewed interest in the transnational networks established through the Women's International Democratic Federation, or WIDF, the organization of reference for anti-fascist, communist, and socialist women in the Cold War period. Scholars have underlined the solidarity between female activists across Cold War borders, as well as the power differentials and tensions between Western, Eastern, and Third War women's organizations. The case of Yugoslavia is a specific and significant one, given that as a result of the Soviet-Yugoslav split of 1948, the representatives of Yugoslavia and of the Anti-Fascist Women's Front, or AFG, were expelled from the WIDF in 1949. To overcome international isolation, Yugoslav representatives strive to establish their own bilateral connections with women's organizations internationally, particularly in the Global South. In this presentation, I will explore the beginning of non-aligned connections by looking at official representations of encounters with African and Asian women between the mid-50s and the mid-60s, the first intensive period of non-aligned internationalist exchanges. This paper is based on the collection of the monthly periodical Žena u borbi, Woman in the Struggle, renamed Žena in 1957, and published by the Croatian branch of the Yugoslav State Socialist Women's Organization, CGD or CTAJ, from 1961 onwards. Gendered and racialized representation of African and Asian female leaders and women's organization in official Yugoslav publication targeted at female readership and were certainly part of overall Yugoslav performances of political solidarity, to use the words of Subotić and Vučetić. These performances aimed at increasing the status of Yugoslavia worldwide. Such representations also partook in what Catherine Baker defines as transnational formations of race during state socialism, and contributed to build Yugoslavia's ambiguous geopolitical and racialized identities in relation to the Global South, to use Baker's words. If you assume, however, that Yugoslav women were merely adopting a Yugocentric or Eurocentric position in their transnational encounters, we fail to capture, in my view, the full transnational significance of the new gendered imaginaries of modernization and utopia that circulated via the WIDF and non-aligned networks as a result of the cultural Cold War between East and West and its extension to the Third World. Such imaginaries generated new gender pedagogies oriented towards the emancipation of rural and illiterate women at a national level, and also created new modernizing discourses of sisterhood and transnational identification, not just in East-South connections, but also in South-South connection, as in the case of Egyptian women's encounters with other activists from the Global South studied by Laura Beer. Global socialist feminism, rather than post-socialist feminism, seems to be the real missing other of transnational feminism, as we recently argued with Christine Gozzi in a piece on Feminist Review. In this presentation, therefore, I explore how Yugoslav encounters with non-aligned female subjects were represented. Encounters with prominent female leaders in the Global South, with activists from state-sponsored women's organizations emerging from anti-colonial struggles, and with female students from the non-aligned countries residing in Yugoslavia on temporary visits. So the first reported encounters in Žena u borbi are with women from India, whose role in the non-aligned movement was extremely prominent in the mid-50s. One of the first reports addresses the visit of the sister of Nehru, Viraya Lakshmi Pandit, India's ambassador to the USSR, the USA, and Mexico between 47 and 51, and the first woman president of the United Nations General Assembly in 53. Lakshmi Pandit led the first fact-finding mission to Yugoslavia in 54. The magazine reported her visit in detail and emphasized her position as a president of the US General Assembly and her satisfaction at Yugoslavia's respect for UN principles. In 55, this was followed by the visit of Nehru himself, together with his daughter, Indira Gandhi, who was given a volume on women's participation in the liberation movement as a present. A particularly fascinating look into non-alignment comes from a series of reports that follow the travels of Jovanka Broz, Tito's wife, who accompanied the president on his diplomatic missions across the world. The magazine reported her travels with Tito to several countries, including Indonesia, Ceylon, Ethiopia, Togo, Guinea, Morocco, and Tunisia between 59 and 61. The tone was direct and personal, as in this opening passage from 59, which enticed readers to partake in Jovanka's travels, and I'm reading this passage. On behalf of the editorial board of Žena, Comrade Beba Krajačić asked Comrade Jovanka Broz that she narrate some of her impressions from the trip that brought our President Tito to Indonesia and other friendly countries in Asia and Africa. Comrade Jovanka happily accepted the invitation to share with readers some of her impressions of that faraway, tiresome trip, which also made it unforgettable. It's interesting to see that the trip is presented as tiresome rather than glamorous, so as to emphasize Jovanka's and Tito's hard work for Yugoslav citizens. The possibility to discuss transnational women's issues while on travel also provided Jovanka with additional status and authority, even though she was not an official representative of State Socialist Women's Organization. For each country visited by the couple, there were detailed accounts of legislation concerning women and of women's struggles in the liberation movement, and accounts of the formation of new women's organizations. These were accompanied by photographs of Jovanka and representatives of local women's organizations displaying their modern femininity in their best outfits, alongside more maternalistic images of the Yugoslav First Lady meeting school children and visiting local institutions. The identification between Yugoslav women's participation in the liberation struggle and Asian and African women's fight for liberation from colonialism was especially prominent, also given Jovanka's partisan background, which facilitated such mirroring between the Yugoslav anti-fascist struggle and the many anti-colonial struggles across the world. And such parallel was also established by some of the visitors, such as Hartini, one of the wives of President Sukarno, when she visited Zagreb in 1960. And she really created this parallel between the women of Indonesia actively taking part in the liberation of their country and the women of Yugoslavia doing the same. And this motive of both of them fighting against foreign oppressors was very prominent. Such armed mobilization, however, was largely absent from a visual perspective in the magazine, even when it came to Algerian female partisans, for instance. And the accent was on former partisans now being engaged in political work for their respective countries, displaying the qualities of girls and women next door, that is beauty, modesty, and femininity. Representation of female leadership at the highest level, similarly, contain a mixture of modernization discourse and a restatement of gender norms. For instance, when it comes to the election of Sirimavo Bandaranaike in 1960, the first female prime minister in the world, and also the first to be a minister of interior and defense in 1960. Written by a male journalist of diplomatic history, Ivo Mihovilovic, the article noted the emergence of Asian female leaders on the scene, starting with Lakshmi Pandit and Indira Gandhi, and it then stressed that it would be wrong to think that Bandaranaike was only elected as a result of the assassination of her husband. Rather, she had great qualities and she managed to navigate Sri Lanka's political crisis better than men. However, it was underlined that before this assassination, the prime minister had not been previously politically engaged, but was rather a discreet collaborator of her husband, and she didn't want to stand out too much. She was also a model wife with 3 children, so gender norms were restated in this article alongside some kind of class norm. There was some kind of class tension related to the fact that Sirimavo's father was a former colonial officer and rich plantation owner. However, it was reported that he was not oblivious to social injustice, for instance. And such tensions were also related to Sirimavo's education in the St. Bridget's convent in Colombo, where the Irish nuns attempted to convert her to European culture and Catholicism. However, she remained a Buddhist, so she did not comply with colonization. So it was said at the end that Sirimavo was a model of contemporary Asian femininity, which in her person combined the best of great tradition and old civilization with the spirit of modern times. Yugoslav activists could easily identify with activists from the global south, not only due to their common experience as revolutionary and female and freedom fighters, but also due to their similar efforts in emancipating women in new post-colonial states. Women's struggles for their political, social, and economic rights, and their attempt to overcome conservative religious norms and illiteracy was part and parcel of this modernization effort in the 50s and 60s. And Yugoslav activists frequently exchange impressions with activists from the global south concerning legal obstacles to women's equality and ongoing challenges to women's emancipation and modernization. Issues related to Islam and Sharia law were specifically of interest to Yugoslav women, given that Yugoslavia itself banned the full veil in the republics with an Ottoman heritage between the late 40s and early 50s. A 54 article focused on women's movement in Egypt with the orientalizing subtitle "From the Harem to Politics," mentioning the first movements to get rid of the veil in the 20s and arguing that even if the current status of women in Egypt cannot be compared to that of women in Central Europe, there has been nonetheless a rapid improvement in a short span of time. The article reported the work of notable activist Doria Shafik, educated at the Sorbonne in France and president of the association Bent el Nila, or Daughter of the Nile, which had 7,000 members. Shafik was strenuous in her defense of women's rights and managed to obtain women's rights to vote in 1956 after storming the Egyptian parliament with 1,000 women in 51 and after a prolonged hunger strike in 54. Her radicalism was not tolerated under Nasser, however, who put her under house arrest in 57. after she undertook a second hunger strike in the Indian embassy. Shafiq's look was described as quite different from the type of woman we imagine when we hear of a fighter for women's rights. Young, charming, extremely elegant, and very feminine, she does not lag behind even the most dynamic of men in terms of wit, fighting spirit, and engagement. Such description points at the tensions raised by women's movement in Yugoslavia itself, which were under the constant threat of being labeled as feminist. That is, deviating from the struggle for socialism and engaging in an unfeminine struggle against men, in an allegedly similarity to the bourgeois movement of the interwar period. Yugoslav reports, moreover, were keen to emphasize third world activists' difference from bourgeois Western feminists when it came to women's organizing. And in the case of Shafiq, for instance, it was noted that she was aware that her people could not copycat European culture, and she was not against Islam per se, but rather against the tradition that prevents progress. This mirrored the discourse of Yugoslav women themselves, which were keen to stress the primacy of class over gender and the importance of women's mass organization in cooperation with political parties and state institutions. Alongside the primacy of class analysis over gender, what Yugoslavia also promoted in the diplomatic agenda was economic independence through industrialization and modernization, as shown by the research that Dubravka Sekulic was mentioning yesterday about Energo Invest and other Yugoslav companies abroad. The building of industries, streets, welfare infrastructure, such as hospitals and schools, and the expansion of education were all seen as crucial means to achieve political independence and economical independence as well. That's why many accounts in Jena detail Yugoslav representatives' visits to local orphanages, clinics, schools, and newly built institutions. During her trip to West Africa and North Africa, for instance, Jovanka visited a nursing school for women in Ghana, an orphanages in Morocco, and a women's cooperative in Tunisia. In turn, when foreign guests were welcomed in Yugoslavia, they were often taken to see similar sites in Zagreb or Belgrade and in smaller centers. When it comes to African women's movement, where they occupy a less prominent position than Asian or Middle Eastern movements in the magazine, it is only in the 60s that African women are listed among non-aligned students and experts attending different kinds of congresses and courses in Yugoslavia. Here we see our Keita, a trade unionist and midwife. Women's experience of non-aligned migration is very much neglected in popular memory, which tends to focus on male students from Africa and the Middle East studying as doctors, engineers, or dentists. A 1965 report listed a number of African and Middle Eastern students doing their studies in Yugoslavia. And they were from different countries such as Sudan, Kenya, Israel, and Jordan. And they were studying different subjects such as administration, economics, pharmacy, and so on. One of them mentioned that her Yugoslav roommate in the student dorm married a colleague from Algiers. All of them emphasized the limited educational opportunities existing in their own countries and their need to specialize abroad. Another 67 report was dedicated to Kenyan girls who studied as dactylographers thanks to a UN grant. The first part of the article detailed their difficulties in achieving an education in newly independent Kenya and the rapidly evolving role of women in the private and public sphere. Only one of them had completed primary school and only one had ever been employed. The second part of the article addressed the 5 students' desire for career improvement and further education, but also their attachment to their homeland, families, and friends. The author asked them to mention 3 words that were dearest to them. And family was always in the first place to signify that women returned their place as homemakers and mothers, even though they had further career aspirations and educational aspirations. Such statement echoed the working mother gender contract typical of socialist Yugoslavia and other state socialist regimes, and the idea that women's emancipation would mainly happen through education and employment, while women's role as caretakers and mothers would be modernized, but nonetheless preserved within the family. A paradigmatic definition of women's role as citizens and mothers was included in the interview with Sorastri Karma Trimurti, an economist and journalist from Indonesia, an activist in women's and independence movement, who was also the wife of activist Sayuti Melik, known as the typist of the Indonesian Declaration of Independence. She was also a mother of two and had served as the first labor minister from 47 to 48. She spent 3 months in Yugoslavia in 1963, leading a delegation of Indonesian experts who specialized in various fields. After a discussion with fellow journalist Maria Eberjnik-Fuchs on the different women's organizations existing in Indonesia and their achievements, Trimurti was asked about her aspiration and preoccupation as a woman. And she replied with her wish list of a minimum to which every woman should strive for. She said, first of all, to be a good citizen, then a good mom and a good wife. In order to be able to realize such life conceptions, she must not live and work only for herself. She must learn how to raise her children in that direction. A good woman knows how to manage her home, how to organize life in it for everything that she decides, which also includes choosing a good husband. All these requirements aren't easy, as they entail responsibility, but they are the minimum required in life. Trimurti's wish list undoubtedly spoke to Yugoslav activists who were also trying to combine their engagement in the public sphere with family responsibilities, and who were often married to fellow party members and activists. As Woodward noted, the working mother gender contract ideal reflected the gender norms typical of the educated middle class in Yugoslavia, and of also the party leadership. The representation of female leaders, activists, and experts from non-aligned countries presented in the Yugoslav press reproduced this vision of a good citizen and a good wife and mother at a transnational level, highlighting the global circulation of gendered imaginaries of citizenship and modernization for a transnational generation of Cold War female activists. The idea that socialist modernization, economic development, and women's participation in the public sphere could help overcoming class, gender, and race divides was obviously not uncontested, but was shared to a certain extent by the transnational generation, which encompassed both Yugoslav activists and their counterparts in the global South. Thank you so much. So I'm gonna try to stop sharing. There you go.
Thank you. Thank you, Chiara. Thank you both for your presentations and for keeping on time. And now we will hear Konstantin Kilibarda for presenting us some comments. We have 6 to 7 minutes for that. So please, Konstantin, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to Chiara and Peter for those great comments. So I'm just going to start off with some reflections on Peter's paper and some questions, and then proceed to Chiara's. So in terms of, Peter, your paper, I really appreciated the tension you set up in your paper, not so much in your presentation, between NAM as a movement and NAM as an intergovernmental organization, right? And I think that really expresses the tensions between the top-down and bottom-up nature of the anti-colonial struggles going on in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, right? So you had their like instantiation in international politics, which by its nature is like a conservative setting, but also all these bottom-up processes going on in transnational connections, right? And I think Chiara's paper very much points to those. So I thought that was a nice dovetailing of the two papers. However, I do want to push back on the Bandung-Belgrade dichotomy, and I see Paul has already preempted some of my comments. So that's great to see Paul's contribution as well. But I want to do so on two fronts, right? And first of all is the portrayal of Bandung as an expression of simply conservative continental solidarity, right? But we need to view Bandung in its historical context as an expression of newly decolonized states emerging on the world stage, and for the first time, kind of breaking the global color line and meeting independently of European powers, right? Bandung comes 1 year after the French defeated Dien Bien Phu by the Viet Minh in Vietnam, and 1 year after the launch of the Algerian Revolution, right, and the War of Independence in Algeria. And so it's very much of that moment. And it expresses kind of an Afro-Asian solidarity that hadn't been present to that point, or it had been present, but never at the state level, right? It was also pretty radical in its inclusion of China at a time when the United Nations still recognized Chiang Kai-shek's government in Formosa, later Taiwan, as the legitimate government of the whole of China, right? So there were kind of these radical ruptures within Bandung that I think recognizing it or calling it conservative continental solidarity does a disservice to the legacy of Bandung. And Bandung's more radical edge was really instantiated in Cairo in 1957 with the formation of the Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Organization, which was a combination of state governments and radical national liberation movements and really served as a headquarters and mechanism for channeling state funding to liberation movements throughout the global South. And both China and the Soviet Union played a role in APSO as well. So I think Bandung's legacies are a little more complex, especially if we look at the formation of the Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Organization 2 years later, and the kind of continuity of Afro-Asian solidarity in these kind of more transnational networks that emerged. Second, the portrayal of NAM as somehow more radical needs to again be situated in the context of the shifting terrain of the Cold War, right? And so while NAM definitely seemed like another radical break among many since Bandung in 1961, it should be noted that by the mid-1960s, many countries were viewing NAM as also similarly playing on the kind of conservative elements you're pointing to, right? And in particular, a critique emerges from Indonesia and China, which closely collaborated during the early to mid-1960s. And we're in the process of setting up a second Bandung, but with much more radical edge to it than the initial Bandung and the 10 principles, right? Indonesia had been kicked out of the International Olympic Committee and had actually departed the UN, and China was still outside of the UN system. And they were seeking to set up first through the games of the new emerging forces and later a conference of new emerging forces that would be consolidated at a second Bandung, right? And then there was also the Cuban Revolution and the Cuban critique, which came through in the formation of the Organization for the Solidarity with the Peoples of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, which was an organization formed during the Tricontinental Summit in Havana. And the danger of these kind of formations that combine states and movements was really clear at the Tricontinental, because a lot of Latin American governments weren't even invited, but instead rebel movements in those countries were invited, right? And so the OAS, which had already ejected Cuba, was, you know, kind of alarm bells were ringing off at the OAS, and they condemned the Tricontinental for doing this, right? And so you have Indonesia, China, Cuba, and kind of these liberation movements challenging the international system in much deeper ways than the NAM was doing, which was still trying to work within its strictures. So that's why I don't think portraying it as the kind of radical edge of the broader movements happening is necessarily accurate. And we see in the response to the Indonesian, Chinese, Cuban initiatives, we see violent countermeasures and repressions and global counterinsurgency being unleashed, right? And so Ahmed Ben Bella, who hosts the second Bandung in 1965, is overthrown in 1965 by Hurai Boumediene. Sukarno is also overthrown in 1965 by Suharto, and unleashing a mass killing of Indonesian communists and Indonesian Chinese diaspora. And Mehdi Ben Barka, who organized the Tricontinental, is disappeared and assassinated in Paris in 1965, 2 months before the Tricontinental. So it's very clear that the threat of this kind of emerging solidarities that were outside of the UN system was met with clear, you know, force and a kind of global counterinsurgency campaign, something that wasn't reserved for the non-aligned movement and its leaders. And so that different in the West, which emphasizes divisions between all these movements, because at the end of the day, a lot of the same leaders, a lot of the same movements, a lot of the same countries participated in all these different forms, right? And they were trying to find bases of unity. So we can also look at these different forms, not necessarily as counterposed to each other. You know, kind of fourth world that existed across the three worlds of the Cold War era. So that's like the silences on indigenous people, but also on processes of internal, very nuanced take on all these kind of dynamics and complications around race, gender, revolutionary politics, and in particular, drawing on Laura Beer's work on Egypt and May Taha's work as well, bear belts for party state politics, but more recent scholarship has really pointed to these as sites of important transnational exchanges and kind of bottom-up instantiation tensions existed. Similarly, I'm curious to know if Kadaj played an important role in organizing the Belgrade conference, because I know, for instance, in the context of the Tricontinental, women played a huge role in organizing parties, sporting events, chess tournaments. They organized 60,000 study circles across Cuba to educate engagement with a broader discussion around racialization and Eurocentrism. And you kind of probe and nuance this in interesting ways and say that while you point to clear examples of Orientalism and racialization, you also say that only seeing these interventions in those terms loses a lot of like nuance. And, you know, so I just want you to kind of build on that nuance and kind of probe that a little more and what prompted those comments. And then finally, in terms of the Sejidin Kadaj itself and related to this question of racialization, I'm curious to know what the relationships within the organization were in terms of the different nations and nationalities of Yugoslavia, right? And Yugoslavia's own North-South divisions, right? So was this an organization dominated by women from northern or more developed republics and provinces? Or in their engagements with African, Asian, and Latin American women's organizations, did they allow women from southern republics and provinces to play a prominent role? And the reason I'm asking this is because for the Soviet Union very much foregrounded Central Asian communists in its engagements with Afro-Asian organizations, right? And the Soviet Union very much presented itself as an Asian state by foregrounding Asian communists, Central Asian communists in the Soviet Union in these fora, right? So I'm just wondering if there's something similar going on at the Yugoslav level and in terms of Yugoslavia's own internal contradictions. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Konstantin. You were a bit over the time, but I didn't want to stop you because your reading was of these papers was very deep, and your comments were really insightful, and I think it will be helpful for us all. So thank you very much. And now I will let the speakers respond, and I will kindly ask you to try to stick to maybe 5 minutes each in responding, so we have time for others to also ask questions.
So who's first?
Professor Pilic, you could go first, or maybe Chiara, if because of your baby, maybe do you have time? Okay.
Right. Thank you. Right, Konstantin. I wouldn't really disagree with you about the materials that you presented, which I did not present, on the Afro-Asian People's Solidarity movement, on exactly what was going on within the attempts to hold a second Bandung in 1965, and on tricontinentalism. Yes, I mean, that was more radical than the Bandung heritage, and it was more radical than much of the Nonline, I agree. But where I would disagree with you is that I think it was a different political process. I think something led by the Chinese, and what you didn't mention was that the Chinese then were totally engaged in a conflict with the Soviet Union rather than the United States, and they were engaged in trying to mobilize support at the grassroots within developing countries. And so there was a very, very difficult political process going on, and that showed itself in that with the Chinese successfully getting an alliance with the Algerians and a conference center actually being built and a preparatory second Bandung conference actually taking place. But in fact, the whole thing collapsed. The governments of Asia and Africa did not wish to take part, and they only attended in order to, only attended the foreign ministers meeting in order to prevent the main conference going ahead. So I do regard the heritage of 1955 as conservative, but for the same sort of reason as you do, look at conservative forces in the developing world, because it was so tied to the governments wanting to behave in a conservative manner in international diplomacy. And I don't think you can talk about the Afro-Asian Solidarity movement as being a heritage of Bandung. other than a label, I suppose, of Afro-Asian. So perhaps I'll need to put a caveat on the way I talk about bicontinental solidarity. Perhaps I should call it bicontinental intergovernmental solidarity. And certainly very reactionary people were present at Bandung, as well as the communist people. And to Aida Hozic and to Konstantin, I would point out that the anti-colonialism was definitely not there in 1955, to such an extent that somebody has already yesterday referred to a regime as an apartheid regime, meaning the Rhodesian regime. The leaders of Rhodesia were invited to Bandung, the Central African Federation, and they simply refused to turn up. But you know, what a historical embarrassment would that have been? Because the people in Rhodesia were virtually as bad, not totally as bad, as apartheid in South Africa. So the people who set up Bandung were not playing any form of racial politics. They were very much intergovernmental orientated. So, you know, I think I agree with your view of what was going on, but I would put it into a different category. The other big question you asked me was to talk about the difference between sovereignty and self-determination and the questions that raises about indigenous people and other groups who are contesting from within countries in their politics. Well, much as the Nonline has gone further, sorry, the Nonline movement as an institution has gone further than many other intergovernmental institutions in opening themselves up to some non-governmental processes. They've done it in a very limited manner. And the only real manner in which they've opened up is recognizing and treating as equals the African liberation movements and the Palestine liberation movement as part of their diplomacy. So, and initially, right at the beginning in 1961, the Algerian National Front, which doesn't sound as good in English as Front National sounds in French. Well, I suppose even that sounds bad in French now. But the Algerian FLN was a full participant in Belgrade, although it was not a recognized government. So there is that limited movement into contesting populations and the challenge from self-determination. But it's generally something that's been squashed in the Nonline and squashed by most governments. And the furthest most governments will go is in the sort of situation that's arising, for example, over Azerbaijan, saying that Azerbaijan is oppressing the self-determination rights of the Armenians if they don't allow self-government within Azerbaijan of Nagorno-Karabakh. But in India even voted against that in the UN last year. So self-determination has become in international diplomacy simply European colonies have the right to independence. And that's all it is in international law. Whereas in international politics, there's not an agreement around the world as to what it should be, and it's highly contested and is not really very effective at the global level, except as a matter of human rights. And even then it has to be argued in terms of the other human rights. There is not a recognized right to self-determination in the world system, and nor can there be. And there are 53 governments who are never going to allow that question onto the agenda in the Organization of African Unity, and various other governments around the world which are going to block it as well. So it's not a movement that's going to get very far. Sorry, I said too much. Chiara.
Thank you, Chiara, please.
Yeah, thank you, Konstantin, very much for your comments. They are excellent and really useful. I must say that you know, my investigation into women and non-alignment is still at its early stage. I mean, I did some work when I was writing my dissertation, and I have been looking into the archives of collections of Vida Tomšić, but I'm still working on the subject for like like as a whole, you know. And when you're talking about this general tensions within official politics, I wouldn't know what to reply. I mean, I didn't find any material in relation to, you know, what that the official women's organization would take a different position than Yugoslav state officials. My impression was that they very much were following, you know, the foreign policy line, really, in their interactions. And when it comes to the Belgrade conference, I didn't have the impression that they were so prominent in the organization like the Federation of Cuban Women. But what happened was that 5 months before the Belgrade conference, so in April '61, there was a very high profile conference organized by the CDAJ, and they invited Pauline Lumumba. It was just shortly after the assassination of Lumumba. They had Algerian freedom fighters, they had women from Cuba, they had really kind of a good representation of different movements from Africa, different African countries. And that conference was very much like the highlight, I would say, just before the summit of non-aligned chief of state in '61 in December. So that's something that was quite prominent. Afterwards, they were mainly engaging in the summits that were organized during the UN Decade for Women, which I analyzed in my recent article. And when it comes to the engagement of women of different nations and nationalities, one interesting example that I could find, I mean, it's not related specifically to non-alignment, but Dida Raducajini Đorđević, she was from Kosovo, and I saw that apart from being, you know, a big leader in Kosovo itself, she was sent to some of these ILO meetings on the status of Gastarbeiters in Germany. And there was an idea to do a seminar about Gastarbeiters in not just the Yugoslav one, but also those from Maghreb, for instance, and from Tunisia, Morocco, and other countries in Western Europe. So she was engaged in such things. So I think that there you can see you know, somebody from Kosovo was kind of prominent in the agenda. But that's a very interesting lead to look at. I'm not sure to what extent, you know, the Yugoslav women were foregrounding women from less developed republic, as it would happen in the Soviet Union. I have the feeling that I felt, you know, I didn't have the feeling that there was a kind of hegemony of specific republics there when it came to decision making. They were very much, you know, each Republican committee of the CDAJ was doing its own thing when it was needed, and the visitors were visiting different places when they were coming into Yugoslavia, and you have correspondences, you know, what are they going to see in Zagreb, what are they going to see in Belgrade, and so on. And so the engagement, with the issue of race, well, I think that's something, you know, I've tried to nuance, because again, you see that there was some kind of orientalization happening sometimes, at times, some racialized discourse that were part of this general discourse of civilization and modernity, I would say. But at the same time, there was also this mirroring of the experience of liberation movement and liberation fighting. Women who had important losses in the liberation movement, there was this kind of identification with women in the global south who had also been kind of freedom fighters. And also there was really like genuine interest for such movements, and they really tried in this report to understand what was happening in different countries, especially in the formation of these different women's organizations. Either they were state sponsored or not, but there really was a kind of openness to this different instances of organizing and women's organizing in other parts of the world. So I wouldn't discount it, you know, I'd say like the Yugoslav were only putting themselves first and saying, follow our lead, because they really had this idea of self-determination and national paths to socialism in mind. So each country had to find its own kind of specific path also to women's emancipation. And that's what they were kind of following in their policy, I would say.
Thank you both very much. We should be on break now, but given that we've started a couple of minutes later and that this discussion is promising, I would maybe collect a couple of questions. We had some in the chat box, but mostly, I mean, I think that the first one asked by Ida disguised as poll stubs. I think it was partly answered, or the discussion was touched upon. So there was also a comment, the question by Leonora to you, Chiara. Have you seen it?
Yeah, about the female students. Yeah, definitely I can share the material. I mean, this were, I only found this couple of reports about students from Africa and Middle East, and no, there were the two I found, let's say, specifically on female students. So I can share those with you definitely, and it would be interesting to know more about how much this female experience of non-aligned studies and visits was accounted for in the archives.
If there's any more questions, I would kindly ask you to use this button, raise hand, so you can ask the question, or you can just type it in the chat box, whichever is easier, but I believe that the first option is probably more efficient. So are there any questions? Leonora, do you want to ask a question?
I do actually, sorry. Yeah, I was like looking for the raise hand.
That's okay.
Yeah, just like on this note of like, I was looking at, I kind of, you'll see, maybe I will look a bit obsessed by this category third world, because I asked this similar question to Augustine. I mean, I made a similar comment to Augustine yesterday, but like, I have a feel like in your text, there's this kind of like, separation between like Yugoslav women leaders or activists and students, and then the ones from the third world, you know? It's just like a general feel I have, and I maybe like you can also like I would question that category third world, because like sometimes it's confusing between like, I feel there's insufficient questioning of it somehow, like as a category in itself, because like, for example, in the conclusion, there's like, it's sometimes, you know, you talk about like third world, the way the sources talk about the third world, and that's like fine, like, and then other times it's like you are like talking about the third world in that way, and we're not sure, you know what I mean? Like, it would be nice to be able to like differentiate and how you take this category. And also, I mean, third world is not a monolithic, right? And we all know that, and I know that's not your intention at all, but somehow like through this text and writing, and it comes through as monolithic. And I don't know how you could do that. I think we could all maybe collectively think about it as well here, less monolithic. I don't know, by complexity, the third world in between, guillemets, how to say? What's it called?
Inverted commas. No, but I put it in inverted commas, the third words, a number of times in the text.
It's not always, anyway, it's just a general question for everyone to reflect how we can do this, because I think it will be a more general problem, even though our intention is to like criticize, have a critical history of this critical approach. It seems to be like, because we are focused on Yugoslavia, it's like, and in the sources and everything, it still comes through as, you know, this opposition between Yugoslavia and third world. And as some people have underlined, also Yugoslavia can be seen as being one of those third world countries, because after the war, it's just being, it's completely destroyed, and et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, it's just.
Maybe if there's a couple of more questions that we can collect. So I believe this was more a call for reflection than a question. Yep. But if there's maybe if not, we can go to have a break, enjoy a break. Or maybe, Chiara, do you want to comment on this? But I believe it was more of a comment.
Yeah, it's a general comment. I mean, it's a good point though, like to what extent, you know, we take the categories that we find in the sources. I think that's also, and also to what extent this category of the global south is now encompassing that experience and those divisions that we had at that time. And yeah, Vitalis, I think you mentioned it, Konstantin, in the chat, like he's talking also about the fact that this racialization discourse was not the most prevailing one, even in Bandung, that there was this developmentalist narrative and modernization narrative that was much more prominent somehow, and this racialization discourse came afterwards with the influence of African-American scholars and activists. So that there, it's a whole discussion there to what extent, like what kind of categories we're using and where they're coming from, and obviously that needs more reflection, definitely.
So thank you all. We will now have 15 minutes break. Please stay online, just mute yourselves, turn off the cameras, but stay online, and we'll see you 5 p.m. Welcome to the second session of this panel entitled Internationalism, Pragmatism, Idealism, a new round of speakers with us. We will first hear Tvrtko Jakovina from the University of Zagreb, then Gal Kir from the University of Dresden, and the commentator will be Vladimir Runkovski-Korica. So please, guys, the floor is yours. Tvrtko, you're first.
Well, thank you very much. I'll try to be succinct. A word that I haven't been using very much since I read it today in the comments of my paper. Paul wrote it, so now I have all the best words, as Trump would say. It's not easy maybe to summarize what I had in mind, and especially because there were so many things I wanted to address from previous two papers that fit in a way to what I wrote in Croatian. I will start with an article published by Milovan Djilas, who was at the time still number 3 or 4, arguably, in the Yugoslav hierarchy, who upon his return from a gathering in Burma and India as the only representative of one communist party at the gathering of the socialist parties, described India and that part of the world, South Asia, telling that Yugoslavia is Asia in Europe, and that it's been often treated as Asia in Europe, country where many people lived in squalor and appalling conditions, not unlike so many Indians and Burmese. But that there is something else that's connecting or giving strength to the people around the world. Indians have proved that by throwing out the British after the Second World War, and when these newly established countries are going to be connected with new technology, they will be able to pick up and reach happiness soon after the end of in the period after the Second World War. Well, it became clear that many of these countries in the era when sovereignty was an obsession did not become sovereign or not fully sovereign. And I'm quoting several examples from the history of Tanzania, and several quotes of President Julius Nyerere, who was so close to the Yugoslavs, had Yugoslavs advising him how to build a single party system, who was not happy with, or who didn't fight for the independence, only to sell it to the highest bidder, and meaning that Tanzania will even take a slower pace of industrialization if that's the price to remain independent and more sovereign in the international on the international arena. In that sense, Yugoslavia had many connections with many of these countries of the Third World. I also have one quote here from the speaker of the 9th summit of the Non-Aligned, who is still an active journalist with different ideology these days. But Goran Milic in 1989 said, well, Yugoslavia was never really fighting not to be included among the third world countries, although very often these countries, Yugoslavia was counted as one, which is something I will maybe leave for later. So there were many things that were connecting Yugoslavs with the third world countries, and many of these third world countries who became members of NUM have discovered that without the embassies and without the knowledge or know-how, they somehow needed, I would say, a country that was not endangering their sovereignty on the international scene, but also was regarded as a friend. And Yugoslavia has built such an impression among many third world countries. And that was accepted, I would say, by some important European countries like the United Kingdom. In 1964, British diplomats have explained why Yugoslavia was not included in a booklet describing communist activities in Africa, telling that if we are going to paint Yugoslavia with the same color as East Europeans or Soviets or the Chinese, we are not going to help anyone. The Yugoslavs have built such an positive impression of themselves that we should simply omit or not treat them in the same category as the proper communist countries. Now, all this, which could be regarded more idealistic, but I think that most of the things I mentioned already was actually very pragmatic. Yugoslavia was, of course, not West, not the East. How do you fit Yugoslavia on a continent that was starting to unite? Since 1957, West European countries were forming one separate grouping. Then you had another Western countries that were maybe neutral, maybe proper neutral countries, but Leo Mates, a famous Yugoslav diplomat of the older generation, said, well, we are not Switzerland, neither Switzerland nor Sweden. We cannot play the same role on the European continent. Other countries had their affiliations. Yugoslavia simply went where it could. And that is probably the reason, together with the others, we can talk why even Bandung became somehow put aside and partially taken, or Yugoslavia incorporated the whole idea or the ideas or some of the ideas of Bandung into the non-aligned, never being too happy to talk about Bandung as the real beginning of the non-alignment, which was not, but also stressing that Bandung had not only countries from two continents and de facto only one continent, but countries like Japan and China that were countries that were clearly not non-aligned. So Yugoslavia simply found the space for itself. And then Tito died, and after one of, in a way, glorious moments of the non-aligned in 1979, when when Cubans didn't manage to achieve what probably they had in mind, and that was just the last attempt of some of the members of the non-aligned to push it in one direction. Egyptians were doing the same in the late 60s, or were trying to do the same in the 60s, but also Indonesians with something that then became, as we've heard, the new emerging forces. And now you had in the 70s Cubans with the strategic reserve of the Second World or the Soviet bloc. The death of Tito and the presidency of Yugoslavia with no clear leader, especially for countries abroad in Yugoslavia, led to problems for the Yugoslavs. Probably the most visible moment was when Yugoslav foreign minister tried to bring the 8th summit to Yugoslavia, and he failed. The gathering was in Angola. Since Zimbabwe was interested, Zimbabwe got it. It was anyhow time for African country to host a summit. But things have changed by the late 1980s. And then in 1988, a new foreign secretary, the last one of Yugoslavia, went to Cyprus and was, and most of the countries were thrilled to have Yugoslavia again presiding with the movement, and Yugoslavia was equally interested in the leadership. Why? I will try to quote what in his second last speech to the delegates of the Yugoslav parliament, Minister of Foreign Affairs Lončar stated. First of all, the non-alignment came from our need to secure a better and independent global position. Second, it was our firm belief that the world can be stable only if built on the democratic foundations. The third one, everything that's going on around the world now has been confirming our position. There is less alliances, or the world is becoming more neutral or more non-aligned. In the 80s, the two superpowers are not fighting with each other in the late 80s anymore. And Yugoslavia became acceptable leader again for 103 sovereign countries around the world. That is the honor and the advantage. Isn't the proof for that peace we have at our borders, good political and economical relations with both blocs, good communication with the whole world? Isn't that the role we play in new European architecture through the NN group of countries, neutral and non-aligned countries, where Yugoslavia, Cyprus, and Malta were three non-aligned countries, together with a very posh group of neutral countries like Switzerland, Sweden, Austria, and some others, also microscopic countries in Europe. Non-alignment helped us to reach a better treatment in the international economical arena. So overall, the balance of the end result of the policy was definitely, of non-aligned Yugoslav policy was definitely a positive one. But just to quote something else that proves even more, I would say, that pragmatical element in the Yugoslav policy are meetings held in the Yugoslav Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1988, prior to the drafting of the final the declaration of the Belgrade summit. So they started in '88. Leo Mates, whom I mentioned, one of the most important Yugoslav diplomats from the 50s, late 40s, 50s, and 60s. After that, someone who was writing extensively on the non-aligned movement. He said something that's in the title of my paper. Yugoslavia is not some sort of modern Jesus Christ to save the world. We don't even know how to do that. The Yugoslav interest is, they have to be defined through the non-aligned, and we have, through the non-aligned, to find our position in the world, especially in Europe, which became obsession of the Yugoslav politicians in the late 80s, being afraid that Europe will move in certain direction, that Yugoslavia will simply be left behind. Well, it's very easy, or much easier in historiography or in social sciences to detect the problem, how to solve, or in politics, how to solve the problem that might be the problem, and as opposed to medicine, maybe. Yugoslav politicians in the late 80s, in spite of all this, in spite of the very clear interest of German politicians to have Yugoslavia as the presiding country, Germans asking Yugoslav ambassador to the United Nations to participate at the gathering of the non-aligned in Ghana, which was a preparatory meeting in 1990, and all those things, they didn't help. Yugoslav audience simply didn't want to listen. So, and I will finish with this quote or picture. Yugoslav top diplomats are discussing how to explain that Yugoslav position within the non-aligned is not hurting country, but it can help country in everything that's going on. Žika Jazic, former Yugoslav ambassador to India and Cuba, one of the top diplomats at the time, said, well, Hans-Dietrich Genscher is coming to Yugoslavia. Maybe he should address Yugoslav journalists and explain them what are the benefits of the non-aligned policy for the world, and Yugoslavia for the world, and why there are many European countries interested in having Yugoslavia leading the movement. The only thing that Yugoslav Minister of Foreign Affairs added was, sure, and I can ask Gianni De Michelis, Italian Minister of Foreign Affairs, who is also due to come to Yugoslavia, to do the same. Maybe Yugoslav audience is more willing to listen to these two foreigners than everything we say. And as you know, everything was already lost by that time, and my time is up. So I'll wind this presentation up. Thank you.
Thank you, Tvrtko, and thank you for keeping the time. Gal Kieran, it's your turn now. Floor is yours.
Yeah, hello. Do we hear each other?
Yes.
Cool.
Loud and clear.
Good. So I'll probably relate to quite a couple of points made before in preceding speeches. First of all, let me thank to Paul Stubbs, who made a great job of connecting us together. I would nominate him for General Secretary of Yugoslav NAM community at the moment. For the book project that he organizes or edits, I wrote 10 theses on the non-aligned in Yugoslavia that I try to kind of read in a bit more, let's call it anti-colonial frame. So what you can, I will share with you, wait, share screen, now I have to do, share screen, chop, yeah, voila. You see it? It's on?
Yes, yes, it's on.
Okay, good. So basically, it's become from 10 theses, I'll try to present 6 theses or 6.5. It's a political philosophical intervention into the, let's call it the dominant history that is still centering around the trope of Cold War and its subsequent anti-communist ideology. Furthermore, the text is also intervention into what has become a little bit more popular liberal discourse of post-colonialism, this trend of post-colonialism that I here kind of polemically discuss with, is performing a few disavowals that revise and neutralize, let's call radicality of anti-colonial thought and practice. Firstly, at least from, let's say, Baba's intervention or forward to Frantz Fanon, what you get instead of, let's say, theory of antagonism and violence, you would have a tendency towards certain politics of recognition and negotiation.
Alligator. Peter Watt.
Strong tendency within this post-colonial thought to focus on the level of ideas, cultural practices, memory politique. One has to focus, let's say, on change on curricula, textbooks, museum exhibitions, and build, let's call it, a decolonial monument. Obviously, this is necessary but not sufficient condition for decolonization in a bit stronger sense of the word. And also what August spoke a little bit yesterday about Latin America, but from that perspective, decolonization has always been connected with different intersectional struggles, but always in kind of perspective of socialism, so kind of socialist future. For sure, inside of the NAM or non-aligned alternative or modernity, whatever you call it, there is like ambivalent. We heard about certain political conflicts, but still, like I tried to kind of read it or bring this non-aligned discourse and politics together with anti-colonial thought and practice. So here is just like a small summary of some theses that I will present. First, thesis NAM. Thesis number one. There is no singular frame of Cold War, but a multiplicity of struggle that ruptured with old colonial or new bipolar frame. To speak on the whole sequence from 45 to 89 from the perspective of the Cold War is to perpetuate the hegemonic institutionalization of bipolarity. This also explains the ending of this frame by the coming of Archangel of Fukuyama announcing the end of history. The Second and Third World were defeated. So here I take Third World as certain political project in Prasad sense of definition. And instead of what we call some kind of postmodernist tellers of these micro stories, we receive the flattening out of history by neoliberal modernization. And first of all, one had to settle account with specific past and present. So, as you know, this kind of goes through historical revisionism and this strong anti-totalitarian narrative that equates communism and fascism, Nazism, preceded also by erasure of history and memory of all previous revolutionary experiences from struggles of women, workers, peasants, colonized peoples and nations. So what we have also in Europe, anti-fascism is gradually forgotten, and there is a stronger and stronger and open justification of certain colonial past or colonialism wasn't so bad discourse, taking a center stage of the European politics again. So Cold War, or let's say late Cold War frame is apologetic to history of colonialism, imperialism, and in certain way kind of continues insists today, while an approach countering such revisionism starts 20th century maybe instead of 1945, 1914 as a strong anti-war movement and the split in the left kind of resulting in October Revolution, struggles in Morocco and 20th Spanish Civil War. If we already have to decide, you know, to start that age of 20th century with 1945, so with the end of Second World War, we come with a slightly different perspective if we are taking this critical path that I suggest, right? So first of all, the victory over fascism celebrated in Europe. We shouldn't forget that parts of Europe, like Spain, Portugal, and later on, even in Greece, you have authoritarian fascist governments that are being, not in the middle of Europe, but South Europe, so to speak, by 70s, in the mid 70s, and that kind of rather anti-colonial struggle themselves strike back into Europe in 1968, but also in the 70s. So kind of reading the history through ruptures or through kind of how periphery redefined the course of the 20th century. So this is one thing. On the very same day that capitulation of Germany, right, is signed, you have a huge uprising in Algeria, which is bloodily crushed and which in some way is a kind of let's say, first indicator of anti-colonial struggle that will then 10 years later take really place in a strong war and so on. So this is one. Then you have extension of civil war in Greece, as we know very well from a kind of socialist Yugoslavia perspective. Then you have Chinese communists, independence of India. So all these political events signal a rather very long sequence of anti-colonial struggles that haven't been finished by even '89, which is like the official end of the Cold War with the fall of Berlin Wall. So South Africa apartheid, Israel and Palestine question has been actually worsening in the last decades, not getting any better. All sorts of protectorates or former colonies that we can still speak today. So as Samir Amin already suggested in a few places, also in preparation in 2014 and 15 for the NAM meeting, we cannot speak of bipolar world. So I would add very much in line with what Kole was saying in one of the comments, that there has been a strong encounter of this kind of what was say the more conservative or diplomacy of the state with anti-colonial movement. So there is certain intensification that offers already alternative world. So there are many materialization of this alternative world today, but also in the past. So my kind of rereading of the past wants to connect to this, horizon of alternative future. Number two, ruptures make history. So not empire or capital. And these ruptures are the result of political work of the oppressed. So if one aims to reorient the history, one can return to what Walter Benjamin in his thesis on history says a task of a critical scholar or cultural historian even to reconstruct certain tradition of the oppressed. So this is there is certain aporia, right? Contradiction in terms between reading the history from discontinuum through ruptures and kind of realigning certain tradition of the oppressed. So tradition and ruptures, you would have then diverse discussions that go also to Soviet avant-garde, cultural, political avant-garde, and so on. To prolet cult, this is a very rich terrain of debate about the tradition and the rupture. So kind of the tradition of the oppressed, one call it also subaltern subject, the masses, you can read it in a long chain of defeats, but the non-aligned movement definitely is a clear victory of the oppressed nations. So while this dimension of not yet finished process demands a radical engagement, rupture is never to be considered only from within, but apart from the former colonies, it needs to transform the former colonizers as well. So thinking ruptures also challenges a more recent return to long durée cyclical Anthropocene temporality, which too easily prescribes to political resistance to certain futility and also ignores the specificity of the Capitolocene. So example of 1968 that I already evoked just a bit is, it's not that we shouldn't be reading 1968 what happened in the West and in the East or in Yugoslavia or in Czechoslovakia or in Berkeley or in Paris, in Sorbonne, but I would say that it is a certain echo of events of anti-colonial movement. So there is again this, the move from the primacy of the core countries and political economy and historical discourses, academic discourses, and so on, to the peripheral position. So not taking it as a pejorative, but affirming it. So specific continuity and discontinuity that we can look back through the whole 20th century. And in my book on partisan ruptures in Yugoslavia, I try to show how the partisan liberation struggle kind of develops, of course, with other means, but in next to ruptures through split with Stalin, so in self-management and non-aligned contribution to creation of non-aligned movement. So you would have, certain different temporality of the ruptures and Some of them have weak, some of them have stronger consequences for the local, regional, and sometimes even for global level. Thesis number 3, common denominators of partisan anti-colonial liberation struggle. This is Aporia thesis 2. You don't need, I mean, whoever is interested. I see that I've cut part of the presentation here, or you can see everything. I cannot see the Carl Schmitt. Good, doesn't matter. This is number 3, common denominator.
Still only see the first page of your
Yes,
PDF, Gal.
Yeah?
Yeah, it's only the first page.
Okay, sharing is paused. Just a second. Resume share. Yeah.
No, you need to change your screen to so you go through the PDF.
Is it now coming?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Did you see the summary? You didn't see that?
No.
Okay, sorry. So you will be looking a little bit longer at the summary, and then I will lead you through it. So these are the theses that I'm trying to explain, 6.5 theses. Now we are thesis number 3. Common denominators of partisan and anti-colonial liberation struggle. I call it national social liberation, intersectionalism within the internationalist horizon. Very synthesized and compressed thesis. But I would say that I try to kind of map out certain continuity between partisan and those anti-fascist struggles, liberation struggles with anti-colonial struggles. So those have been seen first as negative struggles, right? So anti-fascist, anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, and some of them also anti-capitalist. In the recent debates on political theory, you would have one shortcut that then became quite popular from negative to positive formal politics done by fascist thinker Carl Schmitt in his theory of the partisan. So you would have a strong echo in certain left thinking like Chantal Mouffe and certain theories of populism. And as you know, Carl Schmitt defines partisan or partisan politics as certain mobility of partisan forces, revolutionary dimension even, while strategically this figure is overdetermined by a telluric belonging. So telluric meaning partisan national belonging to the land. So for him, partisan politics is bound with the fight for national soil. His emblematic example is the Spanish partisans, but not those from Spanish Civil War, but those that were fighting Napoleon. So there is a specific kind of this underground reading of Blut and Boden ideology on the theory of the partisan. And Schmitt cynically calls non-aligned movement and anti-colonial movements as zones of neutrality that promote planetary liberalism. So rather than reducing people's liberation struggle parties and anti-colonial struggles to their negative or nationalistic only aspect, I would claim that they practice certain affirmative politics that entailed first emancipation of culture, at the same time also launching transformative process of the very conception of the land. It's not something authentic or just like origins and so on. So kind of landless, dispossessed peasants did not want to merely liberate the land from foreign colonial powers, but also from their local lords and masters. So the partisan anti-colonial struggles had real effects on all levels of social formations, politically, culturally, and economically. So this is what I call a certain legacy of intersectional or international struggles. These struggles were intersectional as the various coalition struggles of the oppressed demonstrate. So women's emancipation, together with peasants, workers forming new political formations. These were also struggles of the oppressed nations against the colonial rules or new imperialist politics. So most of them surely shared a goal of national popular project, but they also were inscribed in certain internationalist horizons that is often forgotten. So just like one short map. Do you see now the map? Yeah, now it's working.
Yes, yes.
Yes.
Cool. So next point, or thesis number 4, I wanted to present you just a very short sketch that partisan and anti-colonial struggles could not be conducted without the liberation culture, articulated their own imaginaries and weapons of mass creations. So the importance of culture for this struggle have been well documented. I think also tomorrow we'll have a whole afternoon devoted to this. Think politically, theoretically on insistence of Amilcar Cabral or Frantz Fanon promoting culture in the way of sustaining the resistance, even in the time historical time when political military resistance was not possible, or was the culture as the realm that sustained, preservance of the people. So combining return to sources with very modernistic artistic practices speak of certain decolonial modernism, or as Bojanović Dekanić call it, non-aligned modernity, also kind of it goes together with this term of decolonial modernism, which departs, of course, as a critique of this kind of bipolar Cold War mapping. This is one interesting intervention done in '68 by Marcel Broadhurst, the Carte du Monde Politique, as a small minimal intervention in image making, Carte du Monde Utopique. And basically, I was just thinking if there are certain, art forms like painting, like from the visual cultures, of course, exist all kind of stuff from theater to film to photography. Here I took a few examples of like synthesis of certain image of anti-colonial or partisan struggle. So kind of what could be interesting in thinking formalization of these ruptures, what I'm talking about, the history of ruptures. So one, as you very well know, famous Guernica from Pablo Picasso, which you see here in Spanish Pavilion in '37, which was at the same time critique against war, as well as certain calling to arms of artists and other anti-fascists. So thinking about the horrific consequences and at the same time mobilizing. And this Guernica would become also symbol of rehabilitating certain partisan imagery in '60s and '70s and so on. So one example, example from before Diego Rivera, from the conquest, 1930, from the conquest to 1930, 2930, you would have, of course, very much, representation of these different stories from history, thinking murals or frescoes for certain social or socialist realism canon, but at the same time, the whole composition has certain very surrealist element to it. Then we move to Dore Klemencic, partisan drawings, partisan sketchy from the Yugoslav partisan struggle. I mean, you had a lot of figures of liberation that are maybe more famous, but I chose this one that kind of represents certain equality of different activities within the struggle. It's like why this rupture was also so successful, because it united, like what you see, the theater reading, cultural educational project, political project, and military resistance. So you have everything. You didn't have just a culture being ornamentation or propaganda of the politics and kind of reduction to certain militaristic conception, or what was later on a reading of 20th century through only the prism of violence, right? Not even a revolution, but just violence. Then you would have Malangatana, or those that speak Portuguese can correct Malanjatan, Cry for Freedom from 1973. You know, he was invested in Mozambique struggle, so it was just before the end of anti-colonial struggle. There is a dense arrangement of monsters, animals, peoples, and weapons. And I find it as a really beautiful encapsulation of certain affect of liberation, not just the freedom, but affect of revolutionary liberation. So these are certain politico-aesthetical legacies that today need to be retrieved or like kind of appropriated, or what would be said also by Raymond Williams, mobilized for alternative future. Thesis number 5. And here there is this oscillation between Bandung and Belgrade, also by made also by Peter Willets before. Yeah, I would say that with Samir Amin, in terms of political economy, for sure, already Bandung is a historical site of certain rise of the periphery. So it's the first time in the kind of recent world history that periphery, the former colonies, the newly independent states come together. So this is definitely the case, even though through Belgrade and in the decade to follow, things kind of radicalize or are also more institutionalized.
Gal, I'm sorry, I'm terribly sorry for interrupting you. You just need to wrap it up a bit because we're over the time. Sorry.
Yeah, no problem, sorry. So this is just like to give you an example that anti-colonial partisan moment or this kind of politics has specific deterritorializing tendency and certain reterritorialization that is behind it. And I would call it here, you have this aporia between, you know, kind of respect of territorial sovereignty on one side, so kind of this political economy, but also already certain destabilization of it. So one way of reading would be with support of anti-colonial struggles, active neutrality, but also cancellation of debts and extension of economic independence. So, and the thesis 6, just very fast, there is a non-aligned movement, as I read it, is a continuation of certain partisan politics by other means. Nothing, I will just like say that there was a short attempt of certain defragmentation of history and kind of demonstrating a continuous political will in the circumstances in which it's always deemed that there is no alternative. It has been like that already before, and this is what we should be. And as we zoom out, I just put the quote of Frantz Fanon, a great, probably one of the greatest visionary of 20th century, who said very interestingly, already within, you know, like the wave of this alternative modernization, different development, he says a very interesting thing. So it's a criticism, not just of Europe and the West, not to go, but also not to go for this kind of profit-oriented and let's say kind of just imitation of the models. So you have already specific linkage, not just of history of oppression and horrific crimes of colonialism and so on, but also linking it to certain kind of environmental destruction, so kind of in the frame of what Andreas Mann was talking about, certain partisan ecologies. So I'll leave it here. Sorry for being long.
Thank you, Gal. Thank you. Now you can just stop. Okay, perfect. Perfect. Now, Vladimir, it's your turn to share some comments with us.
Thank you very much. I realize that time is moving, so I'm going to try to do this as quickly as possible. So quickly, thank you to Paul and all the organizers and to the speakers who were brilliant, and their papers, which arrived more or less on time, which I had time to read. So jolly good, etc. You know, and they showed all the stuff that we talked about yesterday, and I guess today I wasn't able to come, but you know, the whole shebang from Yugoslav foreign policy and the Nonline, which is a diplomatic story, to one of you know, the transnational different spheres, different levels. Great, okay, but I'm not going to talk about that just because to try to cut time. I just want to say something about Yugoslavia more generally, and I guess this is where it can be possibly interesting from our standpoint. There's quite a road to travel from the two Yugoslavias that we've listened to in the two different perspectives we heard about. So Gal presenting the more radical or idealistic, if I can put it this way, and Twertko the more pragmatic. You know, this is something that perhaps could even be seen historically. So the story from the Yugoslavia that resists German-dominated Europe in summer of 1941, and then the Yugoslavia that is talking about joining, you know, with Western Europe, with its powerful West German core in the late 1980s. That's quite a road to travel for a country, and we can see in that, just in that short story, why Yugoslavia and the Nonline movement could appeal to both radicals and if we can call them pragmatists, both at the time during the Cold War and today. And in a sense, this is all embodied in a particular actor, and that actor could be someone like Vladimir Lončar, who is both a partisan fighter and the foreign minister at the time of the late 80s. And now, in a sense, that kind of gets us to pose a question. Was it Yugoslavia that changed in this time from 1941 to 1989, or was it the world that changed? What would Tito have done if he was still alive in 1989? Maybe that's a question that I could jokingly ask of both our speakers today. And what in effect did non-alignment represent in this story, if it could appeal to both radicals and pragmatists? So I want to take a detour and talk about the history of the 20th century via Eric Hobsbawm and his book, The Age of Extremes. This may be an unlikely place for me to start because I'm probably known to many of you as a Trotskyist, and of course Hobsbawm was a member of the Communist Party until very much its dissolution. So I'm sure he would forgive me if I cite him at this point in time. He speaks in his book about the short 20th century and about revolution in the short 20th century. He notes a very interesting development about revolution. He says that around 1917, around the Russian Revolution, and then presumably just after it from Budapest and Bavaria in Europe all the way to Shanghai in China, in roughly the decade between 1917 and 1927, revolution was very much based in the urban areas on the industrial labor movement. And then it shifts from round about then through the 1930s all the way to about 1980. And it's very much a peasant movement. A peasant revolution becomes predominantly something that happens in peasant countries. So we could go from China and the Long March with Mao via Yugoslavia, Vietnam, Cuba, all the way to Zimbabwe around 1979, 1980. Hence that struggle for national soil that Gal was talking about, the peasantry. And then we get to shift back to the cities and to revolution being an urban thing with Solidarność and the simultaneously the overthrow of the Shah in Iran around 1980, and then waves of democratic revolutions that are very much urban ever since then. So in a sense, this 1930 to about 1980, 1990 kind of time seems to be one of an era of decolonization, if I can put it this way. And in some senses, I think we can pinpoint Yugoslavia and the NAM in that particular period of time. Now, I think that it's quite important to underline that there was a shift in the communist strategy. Communist parties played an important role in this struggle for non-alignment, and generally speaking, in more broadly in decolonization struggles. And the shift in the communist strategy seems to kind of prefigure this move from the urban to the peasant. It happens in Russia in the debate between the left and the right in the party in the Soviet Union, between those who are for permanent revolution and Soviet democracy and all the rest of it, and the urban working class as the leader of revolution. And then on the other hand, those who argue for the building of socialism in one country and who tend to see the worker-peasant alliance, for instance, in China around 26, 27 as an important one. And these kinds of movements are, these kinds of political parties that take inspiration from this notion of socialism in one country, which wins over or wins out in the 1920s debates in the Soviet Union, is the kind that leads the Chinese Revolution, the Yugoslav Revolution, the Cuban Revolution, the Vietnamese Revolution, and so on and so forth. In some cases, this isn't the case, as we've heard as well. And what this seems to me is that this is a struggle of a particular kind, and it's a struggle, if you like, if it's socialism in one country. It's also a question of decolonization. It's about national independence. It's a struggle for equality of nations in the 20th century context. And in this sense, the Yugoslav support for national liberation struggles and for the NAM, for equality of nations in international relations, despite frictions with countries that, in some cases, despite having, resulting in frictions with countries that were helping Yugoslavia. So I think in Tvrtko's paper, there's a reference to supporting the Zimbabwean national liberation struggle. And I grew up in Zimbabwe, so I was quite amused with that one. There was friction also with the United Kingdom, which is a main backer of Yugoslavia in Cold War terms in its security relations with the Soviet Union. So Yugoslavia was prepared to risk wrath from the United Kingdom while supporting such a national liberation struggle. So we see the radical element of Yugoslavia. But then it's also quite happy, as we heard from Agustin yesterday, to say no to giving money to Allende in Chile because that's seen as affecting the internal relations of another state. We also see Yugoslavia as being quite prepared to think about joining the European community in the late 1980s. So it's sort of the pragmatic approach. So we see that radicalism and pragmatism in one. And I would say that the key to understanding this mutual radicalism, pragmatism thing that's going on is to understand Yugoslav foreign policy in the context of that decolonizing wave and that struggle for the equality of states and nation states in international relations, perhaps in other words, a kind of radical pursuit of Wilsonian self-determination in the Cold War era. And I think in Tvrtko's paper, there's a statement that essentially, when we think about it, the NAM seems to be running out of steam in the 1980s, very much at the same time as decolonization is more or less over. So in this spirit, I guess I'll just ask two very quick questions, one to Gal and the other to Tvrtko, one and the other. To Gal, where did the partisans of the period circa 1930 to circa 1990 go? Where are they gone in today's world? And is a partisan state not necessarily a self-limiting straitjacket if we're talking about ruptures against global capitalism? And to Tvrtko, we see the Yugoslavs turn to the European community, or something like the EU, which in round about 1992 with the Maastricht Treaty is accused of limiting the rights of nation states to determine their own policy. So is this not actually in contradiction with the principles of the non-aligned movement? So could you comment on that? Was it Yugoslavia that changed again? Was it the world that changed? And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Vladimir. Now, Tvrtko and Gal, the floor is yours again. You decide.
Should I start?
Yes, why not?
Okay. I would disagree that there was no energy among the NUM in the late 80s. I would say that, or I would argue that they lost the engine of the movement. So that's why Yugoslavia was selected to lead the movement in the late 80s. because those who were competing with Yugoslavia were simply not up to the job. You know, Nicaragua was definitely isolated, afraid of everything that was going on in the Soviet Union with Gorbachev. You know, and for the Yugoslavs, that was their policies of NUM, or ideas of NUM becoming, you know, reality. And finally, what the NUM countries had been preaching for so long, now that's thanks to the superpowers, but turning into reality. So, but I would go a step further to someone who wrote a comment about the possibility of NUM without the context of the Cold War. That was only one part, and the decolonization was, of course, an important part, and maybe the apartheid and racial discrimination another one. Always something that all non-aligned countries could agree very easily on, you know, to be against South Africa and so on. But I mean, major problems these countries had during the 60s, 70s, and 80s are still there, still here. You know, we have inequality, we have the global South and the global North, economical problems, and so on. So with a smart leader, I think that the non-aligned could be more visible or more present, or at least as present as they were in some parts of the Cold War. Unfortunately, I would say that the problem, and I'm referring to the first paper of today, the problem that non-aligned countries were one on the side of the Syrians, or that the Iranians were not vocal in or having their own interests, you know, but that happened many times before with the war between Iraq and Iran, and even Yugoslavia in that sense was not on the side of the country that was attacked because of the Islamic Revolution of '79, you know, and finally, you know, there were 20,000 Yugoslav workers in Iraq in the 1980s, building everything, and probably sending not only the weapons and the atomic shelters that became important later, but, you know, everything from hotels and so on, in spite of the war. So there were many pragmatic elements in the non-aligned, not only that, and things like that, Syria, Iran, which side to take or which side to condemn. There were so many examples from the previous history that simply you couldn't find the same language or to be on the same page. And I mentioned just one war in that context. And maybe two references to two questions also asked via chat. Self-Orientalism, Asia in Europe, what Gillas wrote in 1953, I don't think so. I think that he was praising India and Indians as being stronger than the United Kingdom, you know, that he was actually, I would say, very pragmatic. He said, well, we understand you better, and you are the future of the world, because the only thing you need now is a little bit of technology, and you will become the ruler of the planet. And pragmatism of the Yugoslav policymakers in the 80s, what I quoted from Budimir Lončar's speech, Jure asked about that, was it so sophisticated? And I think actually that the policy they had in the late 80s was, the idea was very sophisticated, more sophisticated than, and that Italian foreign policy was also much more sophisticated in the late 80s than it is today. And I'll give you just the example when it started with Trilaterala, you know, Austria, Italy, and Yugoslavia, and then quadrilateral, and then pentagonala, you know, and those countries. That was basically Italian foreign policy, you know, being a little bit afraid, I guess, of the changes in Europe, but trying to connect or to position Italy in Southern Europe, and to have not so local policy in the Eastern Mediterranean or in the Mediterranean, and Yugoslavia was playing an important part. And then you had the Balkan summit, the first summit of the Balkan countries since the end of the Second World War, held in Yugoslavia in 1988, which was also another type of policy. You had Yugoslavia presiding with the non-aligned movement, and you had Yugoslavia as, it was Yugoslav idea to organize the group of non-aligned and neutral countries within the Helsinki process and the Conference of European Security. So I would say that they were actually, they maybe even overplayed. But as I wrote in my last large publication, you know, unfortunately, everything I just mentioned was far less important than what Mihail Kertész had in mind, or not to mention Milosevic, you know, or Tudjman or so on. I'm done.
Thank you, Gal.
Yo, here we are. So one about, I think that the general frame or some kind of, let's say, alternative idealism and pragmatism is a bit erroneously posed. And it's like any kind of orientation or even political institution that intervenes into specific global, regional, or even local level, you know, basically follows certain ideas, or some kind of, there is this thesis of ideas have a material existence. And if you look at the very successful cases of also liberation struggles and so on, it's not just that that one has to dirty hands with the real reality, but there are certain strategic and very tough choices to make, and they won't be always what I would call, you know, what would be thought as idealist, but they would be very pragmatical. So in certain way, also pragmatism can have a very idealist core. So that's one more kind of philosophical answer to Constellation. And secondly, to the very concrete question, where did partisans go? Right after the decolonization stuff, like immediate answer is of course in the early 90s Zapatistas are kind of neo-partisans, or kind of let's say that have very global echoes and are basically also survived because of very global political platform that very originally intervened into hegemony of US and NAFTA, but also already, you know, announce a certain struggle against the end of history. And on the other side, the partisan of Rojava. So the Kurdish and the different movements that have been, you know, uniting and fighting certain alternative project. And you would also have certain very idealist and pragmatist stances within those, you know, making specific coalitions in order to survive, right? So that's one possible answer. And then in a bit more far-stretched definition, or what you could say as a new collective partisanship, or something that is kind of inspired by Black Lives Matter, that is not just an anti-racist struggle, but always was already social justice struggle, and has certain efficacies that goes far beyond the US context, as we saw in the whole wave of their different protests in across European metropoles as well. So that would be maybe one answer. And as you well know, that there has been quite a strong discussion on this revolutionary reform coming from Rosa Luxemburg, but also many different sources about a certain maximal and certain kind of reformative program that is kind of transitional. So you have a very strong sense of this dialectics between revolutionary and reformatory pragmatism, if you want. Then secondly, also to answer just to Augustine, and there, of course, I would never be saying that you should completely avoid discussing Cold War or a certain view that was indeed enriched in recent discussions. I would say that any kind of materialist analysis or critique has to start from, as we know, from the real existing state of affairs, right? What Walter Benjamin would be saying, the reality is riddled with doxa. So this doxa we have to understand, but then at the same time, as also Marx would be saying, there would be certain projective analysis to the future, so a certain kind of utopian dimension to it, while at the same time, like what I push within, if you want, enriched Cold War, but you can also see it as a parallel or alternative history of people or something like that, is to think through ruptures, for these different ruptures in 20th century in their interiority, and how they kind of connected to each other, and if they had certain lasting effects, and you know how they can become our contemporaries. So we have to understand that also something like Avnoj or 1943 in Yugoslavia was the leap into the emptiness. There was no international support as such that would say, okay, Tito, go for revolutionary Yugoslavia. That was something that came out of political autonomous struggle on one side. So in those moments, right, moments of rupture, there is something that kind of suspends the world trend, the objectivity of bipolarity or of allies of the West, of the East, or certain economic necessity that expects that revolutions will happen in the developed industrial centers of the West, but it actually always happened in periphery. So there is this kind of strong notion of rereading history, I'd say, in relationship to the Cold War, but of course, kind of really affirming the interiority of these ruptures and connecting politics to art and culture, and then understanding a kind of deep efficacy of these movements.
Thank you all very much. There was a lively discussion in the chat box, and there were some very concrete questions, mostly aimed at Tvrtko, and Tvrtko picked them up. But there was one new question for Tvrtko. And maybe we can collect it together with, we have two raised hands. So I will first read the question from Jure Ramšok. Were Cyprus and Malta ever considered to be on the same level as Yugoslavia? So that's Tvrtko for you. And now we have Peter Willett and Bojana Videkanic. They want to ask questions, so please.
Okay, to Gal, I'm very intrigued by your idea of ruptures. And I think you mean, but it didn't seem to be quite explicit in your presentation, a rupture can be of significance because it operates at more than one level, like at the level within society and the upheaval of a challenge within particular countries, but also that spreads out to a challenge at the global level and a challenge to the global system as a whole. And if that's the case, I'm very, very surprised, but maybe it's in your paper, but wasn't in your presentation, that you didn't link all the upheavals of 1968, which you were arguing were not just European and United States, but they were of global significance. You didn't link that to the Vietnam War, because as somebody who went through all the upheavals of 1968, the Vietnam War was the central thing, which was destabilizing Britain. And America. So I presume you'd agree with that link. I see you're nodding, but thank you.
Should we wait for Bojana?
Yes, please. So we can collect, we can have then three questions. Bojana, please.
Thanks. Thank you both for really interesting presentations. And I'm happy, Tvrtko, that you have that you have connected some of that work that Gilas has done and others in diplomacy. And I'm also happy, Gal, that you've provided a kind of introduction to what I'm going to be doing tomorrow. One of the things that I really wanted to emphasize, and I've been listening to all of the presentations yesterday and today, is not rupture, and this is a comment more than a question, but actually continuity. Because Yugoslav partisan war didn't come out of nowhere. Organization of fighting didn't kind of come out of thin air. It came out of very long tradition of anti-imperialism amongst socialists and communists in Yugoslavia, especially between two world wars, and especially amongst the cultural workers. So when Communist Party was made illegal, the Communist Party had to go underground. And so most of the tactics of survival that the communists used in World War II were already developed before World War II, and that's why they were so successful. Number two, and this is where what I'm going to be actually talking about tomorrow, is the link between the political work and the work of the artists. And in fact, I would say that there's a really clear link and continuity and not a rupture between the work of the artists prior to World War II and during the World War II and after in the work of the NAM. And this is something that I'm also making a claim and connection in my book, Non-Aligned Modernism. So there's and in fact, artists who were participating in the so-called left, the fight on the left, if you will, between two world wars, were the same people who were afterwards building the state during, in 1943 and after. So someone was mentioning Kocha Popovic yesterday. So this man was a surrealist poet who was working in Paris with surrealists. And then in the World War II, he wasn't just a fighter, he was a general. And after that, he was building the state. So I don't know, Picasso never came to that level of the kind of partisan work and the state involvement. So, Picasso might have created Guernica, but he actually never fought in Spanish War, which Kocha Popovic did. So I think that there's a real continuity and interesting connections between, between World War II, the non-aligned, and the previous things. So.
Can I respond to some, because I was maybe not so clear. First, thank you for Peter for asking. Yes, my point was actually that it was 1968 was all about the anti-colonial ruptures and movements. So it's like, rather than stressing them as, wow, revolution is again happening in the West or in the East, it is actually intensification or kind of effects of the anti-colonial movement. So you're completely right. Vietnam is one of the things, but not only, right? So you have, let's say, double struggle, so kind of against the authority or kind of political authority and global order. So ruptures, to understand this history for ruptures, is kind of reverse the primacy, how it's now, like not now, but like before it was told from the center, and kind of this is attempt to speak from the periphery. So this, and secondly, I completely also agree with Bojana. There is certain kind of continuity between these ruptures. I said one can start maybe in 1914 already with the split on the left and the anti-war movements in 1917. So you have the whole kind of discussions in the avant-garde and on controversy of the left that are kind of repeating themselves in the Second World War, and then also in certain anti-colonial struggles in their way. So that's definitely a topic, and also certain aesthetical analysis, political aesthetical analysis that is very worthy pursuing. So I'm really looking forward to hear what you say. At the same time, I would say to this a little bit not so nice comment to Picasso, also for Carleja. I mean, Carleja also never came to partisans, but he was one of very important communist thinkers and novelists and stuff. Not to defend him completely and stuff, we know 1952, his speech is a kind of speech that, let's say, some people would at that point call criticizing of socialist realism and kind of embracing bourgeois autonomy of art. While 2 years later, as Ivana Bago's very recent article points out, interestingly, takes a very Fanonist position. So also saying, you know, idealism and pragmatism is a false binary, not just in politics, but also in specific art production orientation. What I want to say is that there are many ways how you mobilize or how you create not weapons of mass destruction, but weapons of mass creation. So that's a kind of emancipated culture or liberation connected to culture does, right? So Picasso had its own limited audiences and stuff, but definitely as a sort of image that kind of remains within also collective consciousness or unconscious even, then resurfaces in 60s and 70s where, you know, it's very important to state that after Second World War, there has been in national histories also of France or Italy and so on, very, let's say, the interpretation of partisan struggles or resistance was very much included in the national projects, right? Instead of, you know, pointing to certain transformative or very revolutionary dimensions and demands that they were also making in Italy and France in Second World War and after it. So it's like Tony Negri when he's in late 60s rereading these anti-fascist resistance thinkers and militancy. He says these are our predecessors and kind of rehabilitates partisan struggle, not just as a negative struggle, but this about the creating new world and so on. So the whole kind of autonomia, operaismo in Italy should be, I think, again read or connected to this history of the Second World War. And then the fights within the left and so on. So yeah, we could discuss about this for a long time, I guess.
I already answered something, I wrote something. So Cyprus was, both Cyprus and Malta, after Malta joined the movement, were very important for Yugoslavia because that was the way how Yugoslavia was stressing the global idea of non-aligned, as opposed to tricontinentalism and the ideas of not only Cuba, but primarily Cuba in the 70s, you know, that non-aligned should be, or that is de facto story of colored continents. So that's why European countries were important, even though there were only 3, but there were many countries who were coming as the observers and some important countries. So that is why Yugoslavia was interested in these. They were never as important, of course. Even Yugoslavia didn't have embassy in La Valletta, but embassy from Rome was covering Malta, which also shows that it was not equally important. Cyprus was a small country, primarily, especially after the war with, after the invasion in '74, interested only in the destiny of the island and interested, like so many other countries, to have it mentioned in the declarations, final declarations of the conferences and ministerial meetings of NUM countries, you know, always that the NUM countries are for the United Island and so on. A question on European European Economic Community and the processes that have started in Europe and Yugoslavia with the application for the membership and all that came in the late 80s. I wouldn't say that was against the idea of. I think that could be there. That Yugoslav role within the non-aligned was that they've seen that as an asset, but close to the end of the Cold War was, I think, the way how to save the federation. That was what they had in mind with the application and with the economical crisis that was looming and so on. I think that the big part of Yugoslav diplomats' efforts to join the Union or something was motivated by the enormous crisis in Yugoslavia. Leading role in the non-aligned was helping Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was visible. Yugoslavia was, especially during the crisis, all presiding over the several or many meetings, and in that sense was in a better position to be seen, to speak up, to be observed easily, and so on. But what crossed my mind when you now asked that for the second time, Vladimir, when movement was starting, they didn't have a problem with countries who had foreign military bases on their territory. The only thing that was needed was, it was enough to say that we have that because of the past, or it's involuntarily, or we aim to liberate ourselves of the foreign military presence. And that was enough. But even later, when the atomic bomb came into the picture among the non-aligned, the non-aligned were not very vocal to oppose the nuclear bomb, because India had one, and then Pakistan, who became member in '79, also, and so on and so on. So I would say that pragmatism was everywhere, all the time.
I'm guessing that's it, right? So I just want to thank you all. It was really, really productive and really interesting. And I'll leave the final word for today to Paul.
Well, just to say thanks to you, Jelena. When we were all knocking on the door, we all got in. We can probably do what we did yesterday, that we'll turn the recording and YouTube off, but if anyone wants to hang out for 20 minutes, that's absolutely fine. Tomorrow, just if people haven't realized, we're going to start with Mila Turelic and then Bojana Videkanic. So it's the other way around from some earlier versions of the program. But that's it. Tomorrow is only day 3.